night, Princess Kate back in the public spotlight, attending her first official event since revealing her cancer diagnosis in March.
Behind the polished doors of a state reception already heavy with protocol, candlelight, and the burden of history, Catherine, Princess of Wales, stopped walking for one terrible second after seeing something she was never meant to see on Camilla's wrist. It was not merely a bracelet. It was said to be one of Queen Elizabeth II's most private pieces, not a public heirloom, not a ceremonial jewel, but an intimate possession associated less with rank than memory. And in that instant, what should have been an evening of diplomatic grace became something far more dangerous, a silent collision between memory, authority, inheritance, and pain. Before we go deeper into what this really meant for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because what unfolded that night was not just another awkward royal moment. It was the kind of quiet shock that can alter how an entire institution understands loyalty. Britain had expected photographs, handshakes, polished smiles, and the usual choreography of monarchy. A state reception was not a family dinner. It was the crown in motion. It was pageantry with purpose, ceremony serving diplomacy, every glance and gesture carrying meaning far beyond the room. That mattered because when something goes wrong in such a setting, it is never just personal. It becomes constitutional theater. It becomes national symbolism. And what those present sensed almost immediately was that something had shifted in the air around the Princess of Wales. Witnesses would later describe the moment in different ways, but nearly all of them returned to the same detail. Catherine had been composed only seconds before, moving with that careful calm for which she had become known, the kind of calm that reassured a public still anxious about the future of the monarchy. Then she saw Camilla extend her hand beneath a bank of lights while greeting a foreign dignitary, and the bracelet caught the glow. Not a broad diamond display, not a familiar public piece, something narrower, older, unmistakably private in feeling. Catherine's face did not collapse. She did not step back. She did not speak. Yet those closest to her said the silence deepened around her. No one raised a voice, but the entire reception seemed to tilt. This was not about jewels in the ordinary sense. It was about permission. It was about who may carry memory and who may display it. In royal life, objects do not remain objects for long. A brooch can become a message. A tiara can become an endorsement. A portrait placement can become an internal verdict. Personal jewelry worn by a senior royal is often understood as language without words. And if the bracelet Catherine believed she recognized was what she feared it was, then the meaning was immense. The country saw sparkle. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Those who know Catherine's public style also know her private discipline. She was not impulsive. She had spent years inside an institution that trained its senior figures to master expression, to conceal discomfort, to endure emotional strain beneath cameras and applause. Yet that was precisely why her reaction mattered. Because when someone that controlled freezes even for a moment, others notice. An equerry standing near the entrance noticed. A lady-in-waiting noticed. One junior member of the household staff, carrying revised seating instructions, later told a friend that the princess looked not angry at first, but wounded. That distinction mattered. Anger belongs to conflict. Wounded silence belongs to betrayal. Camilla, according to several whispered accounts from within palace circles, realized almost at once that Catherine had seen the bracelet. She did not remove it. She did not cover it. She continued through the line, one hand lightly extended, one smile measured and royal, but there was said to be a tightening around her mouth that had not been there earlier in the evening. Camilla had weathered decades of scrutiny. She understood public storms, private judgment, and the cruel permanence of symbolism. Yet even she must have known the difference between being seen in a controversial public role and being seen wearing something believed to belong to the private emotional world of Elizabeth II. King Charles, placed only a short distance away, beneath the blaze of official photography, reportedly did not understand immediately what had happened. He saw Catherine pause. He saw Camilla continue. He noticed the break in rhythm, but not yet the reason. And that, perhaps, was the first tragedy of the evening. A king can sense disturbance before he knows its shape. He can feel protocol strain before he sees the thread that has snapped. Charles had spent much of his reign trying to hold together two fragile things at once, the dignity of the present, and the legitimacy of the future. That night, both seemed suddenly exposed. William, by contrast, understood faster, or at least that is how it was later described by those who studied his movements. He was in conversation nearby, carrying out the familiar burden of public reassurance, but his eyes went first to Catherine, then to Camilla's wrist, then toward his father. He had expected concern. He had not expected anger. What passed over his face, according to one person close to the scene, was something harsher than shock and colder than embarrassment. It was the expression of a man who believed he had just watched a private line being crossed in public. Yet to understand why the bracelet mattered so much, and why Catherine's reaction struck nerves far beyond the reception hall, it is necessary to go back. The story did not begin that evening. The decision, if decision it was, had not been born that hour, under chandeliers and diplomatic music. What happened next requires remembering the strange, careful way Queen Elizabeth II handled personal possessions, emotional symbols, and the difference between official inheritance and private trust. For years, those within the royal household had observed a distinction that the public rarely fully understood. There were crown jewels and state assets, the visible splendor tied to constitutional function. Then there were private pieces, smaller items sometimes linked not to office but to affection, remembrance, and personal history. A state diadem belongs to continuity. A private bracelet may belong to grief. One reflects the monarchy. The other may reflect the woman beneath it. Elizabeth II, by most accounts, understood that difference deeply. She lived inside duty, but she did not confuse duty with intimacy. Among household whisperings that grew stronger after her death was the suggestion that certain personal items had been noted, discussed, or informally associated with particular futures. Not through public announcement, not through some dramatic reading of a will. Royal personal distribution is rarely that theatrical. It is more careful, more coded, more protected. A private understanding may exist in letters, in verbal conversations, in boxes discreetly marked and moved under supervision. The official household was the administrative structure supporting the sovereign and senior royals, but even it operated around circles of sensitivity where emotional legacy mattered as much as inventory. The bracelet at the center of the reception storm was rumored to belong to that quieter category. It was said to have been worn during deeply personal periods of Elizabeth's life, not repeatedly before the nation, but in settings remembered within the family. That mattered because such objects are not simply worn, they are entrusted. If Camilla had received that trust openly, some would argue it was her right as queen consort, but if the matter had never been fully settled, or worse, had been privately understood differently by Catherine and William, then the bracelet was no ornament. It was an open wound. Several months before the reception, there had allegedly been a smaller incident, one that never reached the newspapers, but now appeared, in retrospect, like a warning the family had failed to heed. During preparations for a memorial-related gathering, Catherine was said to have inquired discreetly through staff about several of Elizabeth II's personal effects intended for display or private family reference. The request was not unusual. Catherine had shown consistent sensitivity toward memory, symbolism, and the continuity of the late queen's image. But according to one palace source, the answer she received was oddly vague. Some items were under review. Some remained in private holding. Some decisions, she was told, had not yet been finalized. At the time, Catherine accepted the explanation. She was known for restraint. She did not create scenes. She did not leak frustration. Yet the ambiguity unsettled William. He had already grown increasingly protective of boundaries surrounding his grandmother's legacy and his wife's place within that legacy. This was not greed. It was not acquisition. It was meaning. William understood that the future of the monarchy would not be secured only by law, titles, and ceremonies. It would also be secured by symbols the public could believe in. Catherine, more than almost anyone, had come to represent continuity with grace. To him, therefore, the careless handling of certain private associations was not trivial. It risked confusing the emotional map of the crown. Then came the trigger incident that changed the tone behind palace walls. It happened, according to accounts later repeated in hushed tones, during a private planning session connected to an upcoming royal commemoration. These meetings are far duller than the public imagines, filled with folders, seating drafts, object lists, and ceremonial precedents. Ceremonial precedents meant the order of rank and positioning, who stands where, who enters first, whose presence conveys what message. Yet on that particular day, a tray of selected personal items was brought in for review, among them photographs, notes, and several pieces of jewelry connected to Elizabeth II's private life. Catherine was not meant to attend the first portion but entered later with William after another engagement ran long. Camilla was already in the room. No shouting followed, no glass shattered. But the silence, by all later tellings, was thick enough to feel physical. Camilla had one of the bracelets in hand, not wearing it then, merely turning it beneath the light while discussing, so the claim went, whether certain pieces could appear in future contexts as signs of continuity. Continuity was the central obsession of every modern palace. It meant the visible assurance that the crown passes, adapts, and survives. But continuity can become contested when too many people seek to define it. Catherine is believed to have asked a simple question. Had a final decision been made about personal items associated with the late queen? Those present expected a small answer. Instead, the room chilled. Camilla reportedly replied that the matter was being handled appropriately and that some decisions naturally belonged to the present sovereign and his household. The words were not insulting, yet they carried a message. Authority now flowed through Charles. Through that fact, it also flowed through Camilla's proximity to him. William intervened quickly, not loudly, but with enough force to leave no doubt that he regarded the issue as unresolved. He is said to have remarked that appropriate handling was not the same as agreed understanding. That line, brief though it was, stayed in the memory of those present because it exposed the heart of the problem. The monarchy could survive many things, but not competing versions of legitimacy inside the family itself. Charles entered late into the aftermath of that exchange, and by then the immediate temperature had already dropped into formal politeness. Yet he was informed privately afterward that the matter had caused concern. Concern was palace language. It often meant anger too dangerous to name. The king reportedly disliked the discussion intensely, not because of the bracelet alone, but because it threatened to pull him into a choice between marital loyalty and dynastic stability. That was the truth, beneath so many later decisions. This was not simply Camilla versus Catherine. It was Charles trying to defend the dignity of his wife without undermining the future represented by his son and daughter-in-law. In the days that followed, constitutional advisors were quietly drawn closer to the issue than one might think necessary for a family disagreement over jewelry. But royal conflict is never merely domestic once symbolism attaches to it. Constitutional advisors do not decide who wears a bracelet. They assess risk, narrative, precedence, and consequence. They ask what message a public act sends about succession, authority, and internal order. A state communication was any official signal, written or visual, that could shape public understanding of the monarchy. Even wardrobe choices by senior royals can function like one. The Lord Chamberlain's office also became relevant. The Lord Chamberlain is one of the most senior officers of the royal household, responsible for ceremonial operations and aspects of court organization. If an item connected to the late queen were to appear publicly in a sensitive context, questions of authorization, presentation, and associated meaning could no longer be ignored. Staff began speaking more carefully. File references were checked. Private secretaries compared notes from earlier conversations. A household that had hoped to glide past discomfort now found itself mapping fault lines. Charles, according to sources close to the broader circle, attempted first to contain the matter through quiet conversation. He spoke separately with Camilla and with William. These were not negotiations in a legal sense. There was no tribunal, no family council as novels might imagine. But there were hard truths. To Camilla, Charles is believed to have said that perception mattered as much as entitlement, perhaps more. To William, he reportedly insisted that no slight had been intended and that institutional calm must be preserved. He asked for patience, yet patience, when memory feels violated, is a difficult request. The most painful exchange may have occurred not between Charles and William, but between William and Catherine after that earlier planning room encounter. Those close to them would later suggest that Catherine tried at first to minimize her own hurt. She had spent years deflecting conflict away from herself, years carrying scrutiny with grace. years understanding that public strength often required private silence. But William, seeing her diminish the wound, became more unsettled, not less. He knew the emotional significance Elizabeth II held for Catherine, not simply as sovereign, but as model, guide, and source of trust. If Catherine believed something private had been handled carelessly, William could not treat it as a small misunderstanding. To him, it became a question of whether the future queen would be respected not only in public pageantry, but in the private moral architecture of the family. Catherine herself, as many later reflected, was caught between two instincts that had defined her life inside the monarchy. One was protection. Protect the institution, protect the king, protect stability, protect the public from seeing fracture. The other was truth. Truth about boundaries, about emotional inheritance, about the difference between inclusion and intrusion. She did not want to struggle over possessions. She wanted clarity. Yet clarity, once requested, often reveals resistance, and resistance reveals motive. Weeks passed. The matter seemed to recede. No public scene occurred. No leak emerged. Camilla continued her schedule. Catherine continued hers. Charles pressed ahead with state duties. William appeared composed. The newspapers found other dramas to feed on. Britain saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was more painful. Then came the state reception. It had all the ingredients of royal reassurance: important guests, severe timing, military polish, historic rooms, the sort of evening designed to project unity not just to Britain but to the world. That was precisely why Camilla's appearance with the bracelet, if deliberate, stunned those who understood the backstory. If accidental, it was still astonishing, because by then the sensitivities had been made known. The line had already been identified. Crossing it in private would have been difficult. Crossing it under lights, before diplomats, staff, photographers, and the watchful eyes of an heir and future queen, was something else entirely. Some believed Camilla intended no provocation, only continuity, perhaps even quiet confidence in her standing. Others believed the act carried a harder message, that the present queen consort would not be managed by the emotional assumptions of the next generation. No one could prove intent. But intent is not always what makes history move. Perception does. And the perception inside that room was immediate. Catherine had seen. William had seen her see. Charles had sensed the rupture. The machine of monarchy, so dependent on controlled appearances, had just absorbed a jolt. What happened next became the defining private confrontation of the night. According to accounts that emerged from those orbiting the household, Catherine did not create a scene on the floor. She completed what duty required. She greeted those she must greet. She carried herself with the discipline expected of her. But at a transition point between receiving lines and a smaller private chamber, she reportedly withdrew for a moment, accompanied not by drama, but by controlled urgency. William followed. A private secretary was sent to request the presence of the king. Camilla arrived shortly thereafter. The room, one insider later said, felt colder than the reception hall despite the fire burning there. No one raised a voice, but that did not soften the force of what was said. Catherine is believed to have spoken first, quietly, asking whether the bracelet had been formally released for public wear and whether its appearance had been discussed with those most directly affected by its significance. A simple question. Yet within it lay accusation, hurt, and a plea for truth. Camilla reportedly answered that she had done nothing improper, that the late queen's memory belonged to the family as a whole and not to one interpretation of it. Charles stepped in quickly, hoping to calm the exchange, but by then, William had entered the matter with unmistakable firmness. He is said to have told his father that this was no longer about appearance alone, it was about whether previously expressed concerns had been ignored. He had expected concern. He had not expected repetition. Charles, under immense pressure, responded in the language of monarchy rather than wounded kinship. He insisted that no disrespect had been intended, that no challenge to Catherine's place existed, and that the evening must not be allowed to fracture around private misunderstandings. But that was precisely the problem. Catherine no longer believed it was a misunderstanding. The truth was more painful. For beneath the bracelet dispute lay a broader fear within the Wales household, one that had been growing for some time. William and Catherine increasingly believed that the emotional contours of the future monarchy were being shaped without enough regard for them, even while the institution depended more and more visibly on their credibility. They were asked to embody endurance, modernity, and stability. They were praised as the future. Yet when private lines were tested, the future still seemed expected to absorb discomfort in silence for the sake of the present. This was not merely frustrating. It was corrosive. Charles understood that danger. He may have understood it more deeply in that room than ever before. A reigning monarch cannot openly concede that a family dispute threatens institutional coherence. Yet he can feel it. Succession is not only the legal order by which one sovereign follows another. It is the emotional preparation of a nation to trust what comes next. If the future king and future queen appear privately sidelined in matters tied to memory, legacy, and symbolic inheritance, then continuity weakens, and Charles, who had waited longer than any Prince of Wales in modern history to inherit the throne, knew the cost of waiting in uncertainty. Camilla, however, was not a passive figure in this drama. She had spent years learning how power operates without ever fully announcing itself. She knew what it meant to be judged from outside and measured from within. If she felt cornered that night, she did not show collapse. According to those later briefed in fragments, she told the room that she would not accept insinuations that she had acted in bad faith toward the late Queen or toward Catherine. Those words mattered because they transformed the issue from symbolic confusion into moral accusation. Once that threshold was crossed, there could be no easy smoothing over. The confrontation ended without theatrical resolution. There was no apology on the spot. There was no embrace. There was no family breakthrough. Instead, there was something more royal, and in some ways more tragic, a return to duty with the wound unclosed. They left the room. They resumed their roles. The reception continued. Diplomats smiled. Cameras flashed. The orchestra played. The nation, for a little while longer, knew nothing. But palaces leak. They leak not always through malice, but through tension too intense to remain contained. A look is noticed, a timing shift recorded, a briefing suddenly defensive, a question from a correspondent answered too carefully. By the following morning, whispers had begun moving through editorial corridors in London. Something had happened at the reception. Catherine had been visibly affected. Camilla's jewelry had become the focus of quiet inquiry. No major paper had the full story. Yet the mood around the story hardened quickly because it touched the late Queen, internal hierarchy, and the increasingly sensitive triangle of Charles, Camilla, and the Waleses. Broadcasters did not interrupt programming for a bracelet, but royal correspondents began using language that signaled more than fashion commentary. Questions are being asked. Sources suggest discomfort within the household. Symbolism has become sensitive. These were classic soft entry phrases, ways of warning the audience that private conflict might soon become public narrative. Online, speculation outran certainty within hours. Was the bracelet truly Elizabeth's private piece? Had Catherine objected? Was William involved? Was this another chapter in the slow, hidden struggle over the shape of the modern monarchy? Public reaction divided along familiar but increasingly emotional lines. Some insisted Camilla, as queen consort, had every right to wear what the king permitted. Others argued that rights were not the point, respect was. The late queen's memory, they said, could not be treated like a wardrobe extension in a family already so burdened by generational fracture. Yet beneath these arguments ran a stronger current. People were not really debating jewelry. They were debating legitimacy, affection, and the uneasy transfer of emotional authority from one royal era to another. At Kensington Palace, the pressure intensified. William reportedly refused any suggestion that Catherine issue a smoothing statement. That, he believed, would amount to endorsing the very confusion that had caused the damage. Catherine, ever more careful, is said to have preferred silence over escalation. But silence itself had become difficult. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. Every hour without clarity allowed interpretation to harden into faction. Buckingham Palace faced a familiar but dangerous dilemma. To deny too strongly would dignify the story. To ignore it entirely would invite expansion. To explain the provenance of private jewelry would open a door the institution hated opening. Royal households survive through mystery when they can, but not all mysteries remain stable. When a symbol begins to absorb unresolved tensions, it can become more powerful than a speech. So Charles did what monarchs often do when trapped between personal pain and public duty. He turned to structure. Senior aides, private secretaries, and advisors were pulled into a tighter circle. There was discussion, according to those later informed, not only about the bracelet, but about the broader handling of personal legacy associated with Elizabeth II. Inventories were revisited. Informal understandings were re-examined. Future public use of certain items was quietly restricted pending internal clarity. This was not, formally speaking, a retreat. No palace would describe it that way, but it was an acknowledgement that the monarchy had come too close to symbolic disorder. A private understanding then emerged, though not without cost. Camilla would refrain from wearing a set of items associated too deeply with Elizabeth's private memory in prominent public contexts. No official announcement would be made, no blame would be assigned, no victory would be declared. But the line would, at last, be recognized. Yet even that settlement was emotionally painful, because it did not answer the deeper question Catherine and William had been forced to confront. If respect required confrontation to secure, how secure was it really? The most telling moment may have come a day later, in a quieter room away from the cameras, when Charles and Catherine reportedly met without the larger group. He had expected perhaps formality, perhaps cool distance. What he encountered, if accounts are true, was something sadder. Catherine did not rage, she did not demand punishment. She spoke instead about stewardship, about how the monarchy asks its women, especially, to carry memory with extraordinary care, about how some symbols comfort a nation precisely because they appear untouched by competition. The silence deepened after she spoke. Charles, it is said, looked every bit the exhausted sovereign and every bit the father caught between chapters. He may have responded with more honesty than usual. Not a confession, not a dramatic surrender, but an admission that preserving both love and order inside a royal household is harder than the country imagines. That line, if he said it, may have been the truest of all, because that was the real center of the crisis. This was not merely about whether Camilla wore something she should not have worn. It was about whether the monarchy could still distinguish clearly between possession and meaning, between present authority and future trust, between marital loyalty and dynastic foresight. William's own conversation with his father later that day was reportedly firmer. There are moments when heir and sovereign cease speaking merely as son and father and begin speaking as present reign and future reign. This was one of them. William is believed to have made clear that Catherine could not be placed again in a position where deeply personal symbolism was contested in public. He was not asking for preference. He was demanding protection of the institution's emotional credibility. That mattered, because William was not simply defending his wife. He was defending the monarchy he expected one day to inherit. Charles listened. Whether out of wisdom, weariness, or necessity, he listened. And then, as so often happens in royal life, the family moved toward a symbolic answer rather than a verbal one. At the next significant public appearance, all eyes searched for signs. Not merely who stood where, but who seemed aligned with whom, who carried tension, who projected warmth, who looked diminished. Catherine emerged serene but more solemn than usual. Camilla appeared composed, impeccably so, yet notably without any peace that could revive the controversy. Charles walked between generations with the gravity of a man aware that the public was reading his every movement as a verdict. Then came the moment the cameras loved and commentators replayed endlessly. Charles and William standing side by side for several long seconds while Catherine joined them with measured calm. It was not an embrace, it was not theatrical reconciliation. It was something more powerful in royal terms, an image of continuity after strain, a statement without words that the future had not been pushed aside. Catherine's presence in that frame mattered immensely. She did not look triumphant. She looked burdened, composed and quietly resolute, exactly the qualities that made the public trust her. The country saw a family still functioning, but those who understood the deeper story saw something else. They saw a future queen who had endured a private wound without surrendering her poise. They saw a future king who had drawn a line without collapsing the institution. They saw a reigning sovereign forced at last to recognize that emotional legitimacy cannot be managed indefinitely through silence. Camilla, for her part, remained in place, neither cast out nor publicly rebuked. That, too, was part of the monarchy's strange moral geometry. The institution does not often choose clean endings. It chooses survival. It absorbs hurt. It arranges compromise. It leaves some truths unspoken while allowing symbols to do the work. For supporters of Camilla, this proved her resilience. For critics, it proved that palace tensions rarely end. They merely settle into new forms. Yet even those sympathetic to her understood that the reception had changed something. The room for ambiguity had narrowed. And perhaps that is why this story struck the country so deeply. Because it was never really about one bracelet, one reception, or one strained exchange beneath chandeliers. It was about the late queen's shadow and who may stand inside it. It was about whether continuity can be inherited without first being honored. It was about whether the monarchy, in its most intimate spaces, still knows the difference between formal rank and private trust. The monarchy could survive scandal, criticism, even changing times, but it could not survive the erosion of meaning around the very symbols that hold it together. In the end, Catherine did not stun the state reception by shouting, accusing, or walking out. She stunned it by seeing, understanding, and refusing to let a private line vanish behind public glitter. Her silence carried more force than anger would have. Her restraint exposed more than confrontation might have, and that is why the moment endured. Because in royal life, the deepest crises are often the ones in which almost nothing visible happens at all. Charles remained king. Camilla remained by his side. William and Catherine remained the future. No decree was signed. No title changed hands. No public censure arrived. Yet something significant had still occurred. The monarchy had been reminded, in one sharply painful evening, that preparation is not the same as denial, and continuity is not the same as control. Private pain cannot forever be hidden inside public duty without consequence. The family may have remained outwardly united, but it did so with a deeper understanding of its own wounds. Love and duty could no longer remain in exactly the same form. Respect, once assumed, now had to be guarded. Memory, once thought secure, had to be defended. And the future, quietly but unmistakably, had asked to be acknowledged, not as a distant chapter, but as a living claim already shaping the present. That was the true shock of the night. Not the bracelet itself, but the revelation it forced upon the House of Windsor. The future would no longer simply wait in silence while the past was interpreted around it. Catherine's stillness made that clear. William's anger made it unavoidable. Charles' response made it historic. And the monarchy, bruised but standing, had to choose understanding over denial if it wished to remain believable in the eyes of a nation that sees more than palaces ever imagine. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.